Guten Abend, liebes Taz-Publikum. Guten Abend, liebe Leute, die vielleicht noch nicht zur Taz-Community gehören. Mein Name ist Jan Feddersen. Ich moderiere heute mit, nicht alleine, den 221. Taz-Talk, seitdem wir dieses Format in der Corona-Zeit, am Anfang der Corona-Zeit begründet haben. Das ist zugleich der 17. Taz Queer Talk, auf den wir auch total stolz sind, dass wir diese sehr erfolgreiche Reihe mit begründet haben. Ich will noch mal im Vorwege sagen, Sie können zu dem Talk, den Sie heute hören und sehen werden, können Sie natürlich also Ehre erweisen, indem Sie uns spenden. Das geht über die freiwillige Taz Bezahlstelle, das ist taztalk. Also seien Sie nicht geizig. Geiz ist was ganz Doofes, also zumal in diesen Zeiten, wo so viele auch Weihnachtsgeld bekommen haben oder bekommen werden. Heute Abend haben wir einen ganz besonderen Gast mit einer ganz großen Zeitverschiebung. Herzlich willkommen, Nemat Sadat. Er sitzt in San Diego an der US-amerikanischen Westküste. Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
Das wird er dann gleich alles noch erläutern, denn er kann sogar noch ein bisschen mehr als diese zwei deutschen Worte. Moderieren werden diesen Abend hauptsächlich Vera Kallenberg. Das ist meine Kollegin aus diesem Projekt vom Jahrbuch Sexualitäten. Das ist ein Projekt der queeren Sorte. Wir bringen Aufsätze und Texte und Miniaturen einmal im Jahr heraus. Das ist von der Initiative Queer Nations. Und das Gespräch, das wir heute hören, wird in einer schriftlich erweiterten Form auch im kommenden Jahrbuch, das im Juli kommenden Jahres erscheint, dann publiziert werden. Vera Kallenberg ist meine wunderbare Mitherausgeberin. Ich gehöre da selber mit zum Herausgeberkreis. Vera Kallenberg ist Historikerin für moderne und zeitgenössische europäische und US-Geschichte. Und momentan ist sie an der Universität Bielefeld beschäftigt in einem wissenschaftlichen Projekt. Sie und ich teilen das große Interesse für Afghanistan und also den Kampf von Queers, und den Rest wird sie dann selber erläutern. Das Gespräch wird jetzt auf Englisch geführt werden. Sie können Ihre Fragen stellen auf taztalk@taz.de. Sie können sich rege an der Debatte oder mit Ihren Fragen überhaupt beteiligen. Wir freuen uns sehr. Sie können übrigens auch hinterher noch Statements schicken. Wir leiten sie an Nemat Sadat weiter. Und unerwähnt lassen möchte ich auf gar keinen Fall, dass wir in unserer gelegentlichen Recherche-Flusigkeit völlig übersehen haben, dass Nemat Sadat nämlich bereits Taz-Autor ist. Am 8. November 2016 hat er zur Debatte um Donald Trump, also da war er gerade eben gewählt, dass er einen Kommentar geschrieben hat unter der Überschrift "Zu schwul für Trump". Also ein vorzüglicher Text. Sie können ihn auch noch nachlesen. Gehen Sie auf taz.de, da finden Sie diesen Text unter seinem Namen unmittelbar gespiegelt. Vera, ich übergebe jetzt das Wort an dich. Wir haben uns im Jahrbuch, im Übrigen letzte Bemerkung, entschieden, die Planung wegen dieses Afghanistan-Gesprächs mit Nemat Sadat über den Haufen zu werfen. Wir wollten ihn sprechen. Er ist ein großer Kämpfer für queere Rechte in Afghanistan und anderswo. Herzlich willkommen.
Okay, so it's my turn now, right?
It's your turn.
Okay,
Lady.
hello. Hello, everyone. I welcome you in these rather dark times to our Taz Meets Queer Talk. Today is December 3, 2021. Everyone seems to be talking about COVID, and only very few are still talking about Afghanistan. We find this outrageous and would like to draw attention to the situation there. Our topic for today is LGBTIQ in Afghanistan, everyday life, survival, flight, and exile, how to survive as LGBTIQ under the Taliban in Afghanistan. Our guest is Nemat Sadat. Nemat Sadat is a US-based Afghan-American journalist, novelist, human rights and gay/LGBTIQ activist and political scientist. My name is Vera Kallenberg. I am a historian of modern and contemporary European and US history and currently teaching at Bielefeld University in Germany. Due to my background, I will bring a more scholarly academic perspective. I'm doing this conversation with Jan Feddersen, who is a journalist, a taz editor, and a public intellectual. We are both editors of the German language Yearbook of Sexualities, which is published by Waldstein Publishers. As such, we are guests of the Tageszeitung called Taz, a national German daily newspaper based in Berlin. This conversation will be published in the next issue in 2022. We are recording this conversation to transcribe it properly, of course, but also because we want to help bringing attention to the terrible situation of people in Afghanistan, especially the situation of one of the most vulnerable groups in Afghanistan today, namely queer people, gay people, and trans people of all kinds. The talk will last about an hour, and we will include questions from the audience at a later point in the discussion. The talk will be in English and Turkish, English, that's more my part. So if you would like to ask questions, you can do both Turkish, English, and English via chat, Facebook, and email, and a colleague will send us your questions right away. Let me start by introducing Nemat Sadat. Nemat is known as the first man to publicly come out as gay in Afghanistan. This took place in 2013-14, shortly after he was fired from the American University in Kabul, where he had been working as an assistant professor of political theory. His termination was explicitly motivated by his activities and campaigning for LGBTQ rights, which were considered un-Islamic and a threat to national security. Nemat received several death threats during a fatwa issued by the mullahs and was forced to flee the country. In 2019, he published a novel entitled The Carpet Weaver, a coming-of-age story of a gay youth in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 1980s, published by Random House, a book that received widespread acclaim. Currently, Nemat is organizing support for Afghan LGBTIQ people living in Afghanistan and fleeing Afghanistan. Nemat, I'm very glad and honored that you agreed to talk to us today and inform us about the current situation in Afghanistan. Where are you right now?
I'm currently in San Diego, California.
Okay. So how is it going in San Diego? Was it nice?
Yes, but I'm not really enjoying much. I'm mostly indoors here working night and day, being a humanitarian on a guardian angel for Afghanistan's LGBT community. And sometimes if I'm really lucky, if I get a chance, I'll go work out of a cafe. Okay,
I see. So before we talk about your current involvement, I would like to ask you if you could tell the audience a few more details about your personal background, very briefly, of course, because we could talk about your personal story the whole evening or the whole day. How did your current involvement come about?
My current involvement in the Afghanistan humanitarian crisis?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, it was mid-August and Afghanistan fell. And I said to myself, oh my God, what just happened here? A decade of my work and really 20 years, seeing 20 years of Afghanistan, so much progress being made, all of it just, and knowing that right at that moment that the Taliban have taken over Kabul, that this is it, this is going to regress. We're going to go back into the Stone Ages, we'll go back before the medieval times. And I said to myself, wait a minute, I promise LGBT people in Afghanistan, it's going to get better. And it did get better, right? And now it's not. And I have to figure a way to get them out because there's nothing you can do. During the democratic era, I could change social attitudes by going on social media, by going on mass media, by speaking up for LGBT, but I'm not going to be able to do that. There's now everything, it's gone. It's going to go back to a tyrannical terrorist, and there is no democracy no more in Afghanistan. There's not even a modicum of democracy, right? And so that's why I just got into full gear. And I found out that I could make a list, like a Schindler's List, kind of a list where I could actually put people on this magical list. And I could possibly get them on a US evacuation flight if I get it to the State Department, if I get it to the right channels, if I establish the right connections and get my onto past the Abigail or Kabul airport, I could get them on this flight and get them flown out of the country. And I was very much disheartened on August 26th, 2021, when I had, that morning, I was advised that I could take my people out of the country, that they were cleared for P1 status by the US State Department. And I was given through somebody who works for the US government to get my people to go. So I filled up 5 buses with 175 LGBT people. And they could not make it past the checkpoints because the Taliban refused to let them pass the checkpoints. And then I received an intel about an imminent ISIS threat, and I emailed everybody to just go home. And everyone's hopes and dreams was shattered because they were all thinking like, oh my God, we're all going to go to, well, this is the crazy part. They were going to send them off to Uganda, the most anti-gay country, right, in the whole continent of Africa. We were going to send them there for the interim, and from there, we were going to probably end up in the United States. And I was like thinking about, oh, great, we can establish this LGBT Afghan colony in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and we can establish between 3 different cities, we can disperse this list of mine that was at that time only 300 people. And then everyone's hopes and dreams fell. And I'm like, okay, on that day, because we knew after that there was no chance to get people out on the US or any of the country's evacuation list. I realized, okay, what am I going to do now? Then I've been figuring out ways to get people out by air and by overland to neighboring countries and try to get them to the West. And to date, I have 3 people who have reached the UK. A 4th one is on the way. 7 people are in Abu Dhabi and UAE. And more than 55 people are in Pakistan, and about a dozen people in Iran. And about 7 people from Turkey found out about me, and they're like, we made it to Turkey, but we need help because we don't have a life here. We're hiding from the Turkish government, and there's no way for us to even get registered with UNHCR. Can you please do something? So these are the kind of complications I'm facing. And even students LGBT students who went to India to study university, now they're ready to be sent home. They're like, you need to get me on your list so I have not just LGBT people in Afghanistan, but I have this is a problem with queer migration. It's not just in the country, internally displaced. It's also refugees and dispersed everywhere. And they all want to get to a Western country. They all want to come to Europe. Their dream countries, Canada and the United States, because they're just, I think it's because those are the 2 countries that have the biggest influence in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. Soft power projection really makes a huge difference. So, and so that's where we're at. And the biggest struggle for me is, some of the things I'm doing are questionable, and technically I'm violating.
What do you mean by questionable?
Questionable? Well, there is like things that I should not be doing. I'm not a diplomat. I shouldn't be negotiating humanitarian visas for Afghan nationals to get a visa to the UK or to France or to Canada or this is not what I should be doing. And technically, from what I understand, in certain countries, in certain jurisdictions, this is considered illegal. But
are you doing that alone?
Alone. I'm a one-man army. Of course, I have partners and volunteers who are helping me and are trying to, like, it's not nothing. No one does anything alone. But for the most part, when I wake up and when I go from throughout my day, I'm just interacting with myself and my community. There's very little involvement with other people because the thing is, the other people have closed their doors on me. And you're there. Why are they closing their doors? Everybody was really excited to help Afghans in August, right? Because they saw the images of Afghan refugees falling from the wings of planes, and they're like, we haven't seen this in any kind of Bollywood or Hollywood movie. It reminded them of September 11th terrorist attacks when people were falling off the 100th story of the World Trade Center. They're like, what's the difference between them? They were fighting, those are symbols of freedom, right? The World Trade Center, an airplane, and people, because of fascism coming in, they were like, this is the result of that. And so they were just going to their deaths because of that. So I think that for me personally, the 3 biggest flashpoints of my life were September 11th terrorist attacks. That started my intellectual awakening to really explore US foreign policy in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Then also really understand the pre-Islamic heritage of Afghanistan and my own country's history, which I've kind of ignored growing up, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was me coming out in August 22nd, 2013, after going to Afghanistan, and how that went viral and how that really, was like I broke the taboos on cross-dressing and homosexuality and sodomy and apostasy after I came out as an ex-Muslim too. And so that was a big flashpoint in my life. And then the other thing was like in June of 2016, when Omar Mateen, the supposedly closeted homosexual turned ISIS terrorist, he was also an Afghan American, went and killed, I think about 49 people at the Pulse nightclub in Florida. So that really elevated the conversation for the first time in the United States, because it became a national security issue. It was election year. And then people wanted to talk to me and say, look, what is going on with LGBT people in Afghanistan and the Muslim world? And I appeared, on national media. And then the other thing was really this situation here in August with the fall of Afghanistan. I think each time it's kind of, you see me kind of metamorphose, like my own metamorphosis, my own transition, my own, like I said, the intellectual awakening, then going to Afghanistan. I went as an academic, but then I realized I'm an activist. And then this last decade, I was an activist. And then now it's like I'm doing humanitarian work. I have no experience in human response. I'm a human response crisis director now. I've never had zero experience in that,
Yes. But you grew up mostly in the United States, right? Or where did you grow up?
Yeah, mostly.
I ask because I wonder, what is your personal experience when it comes to Afghanistan, and what is it that you hear from people you know?
Yeah, that's the whole irony of this whole situation, is because I was born in Afghanistan in 1979, the year that the Soviets invaded. Okay. And I spent, after 8 months after I was born, my father was a political prisoner. He was released. Then he was working for the Parchami communist government. He was appointed to ambassador of Afghanistan to Germany, at that time, West Germany. So we didn't really just like, I guess I would say privilege, because I didn't have to experience the refugee experience of the last 43 years that Afghans have experienced, like literally having to flee the way that people have been fleeing, right? Overland and being stuck in a different country. I went to Germany, where I was living in an embassy, and we had chauffeurs, I had nannies, and we had very much privilege. And I think coming from that background, I have the sense of the noblesse oblige, like, I've had it so good, let me help out. And so what happened was in 1984, when my father was recalled back to Afghanistan, my mom's side of the family, she belongs to the tribe that was affiliated with the Tsar Shah, the king of Afghanistan. So they're part of the aristocracy and the monarchy clan. And they're like, obviously when communists took over, they stripped them from power and from wealth and everything. So my mom's family had mostly fled to the United States. She had asked my father, let's go move to the US. And my father was like, at that time, it was the Cold War. The world was divided between Eastern and Western Bloc. What are you talking about? We can't go to the enemy state. And so we basically, my dad left, and my mom basically abducted us, and she didn't want us to grow in Afghanistan of war and communism, took me, my older brother and younger sister, and brought us to Southern California in greater Los Angeles. Orange County is where a lot of Afghan Americans were coming to. And basically we lived amongst them, and that's where I grew up. And then the year that I spent when I was basically working at the American University of Afghanistan was really one academic year. So really, I've spent less than 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, but almost everybody in Afghanistan knows me. And I think that's the power of, like, really, when you stand for human rights, when you stand for doing good, it doesn't really matter when you have a heart and a passion for realizing that this people, this community, this nation has been wronged, because yes, Afghans themselves are to blame for many, many wrongdoings, but let's just be very clear. The superpowers of the world and the regional powers, had they not meddled into Afghanistan's meddled inside of Afghanistan, we would not have this country. Afghanistan was a self-sufficient country. Afghanistan had the women's suffrage before Portugal, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. How ironic that Switzerland recently passed gay marriage, and Afghanistan, they're still lynching and hunting down LGBT people. So we regressed, but we didn't need US and NATO occupation to give us women's rights, to give us ethnic minority rights. I think that had Afghanistan was a breadbasket of Central Asia, and it was self-sufficient, reliant on its own. Had Afghanistan continued its modernization path, we probably would have gay rights on its own. We didn't even need to have this, but this is what happened. The last 20 years, the Afghan youth that were LGBT, they felt like they felt that they could really push the envelope for social progress, and they did do that. And now they feel totally betrayed by the US and Western countries, because they're like, you just stripped us, you made us to believe, you come here, the United States in June, raise the rainbow flag in Kabul at the US embassy. Basically, they're sending a message like, we're here, we're supporting you, and then they just abandon them. So these are the kind of issues that we're facing here, and it's not just limited to Afghanistan. I think LGBT people across the Muslim world, they feel that they politicize their sexuality and their gender identity just to play these games, these political games.
I see. What? Good. Siri, nein, I don't want to talk to Siri right now.
Okay.
Really? Okay. Let's go back to Afghanistan right now. What is, in your opinion, the biggest problems for queer people in Afghanistan right now? Because I assume that queer people, on the one hand, have the same problems as everybody else right now in Afghanistan, and on the other hand, they have additional and specific problems related to their oppression and persecution that come on top of that, or even override the other problems. So what is the situation right now? Is there anything left of some sort of everyday life for queer people?
No, there's nothing left.
Nothing left.
Nothing left. Absolutely nothing. There's just nothing left. When people are hiding, I mean, now it's wintertime, so they're probably not hiding in rooftops, but they were hiding in rooftops. They were hiding in basements. They were hiding in closets. People were hiding in ditches. People were hiding in bridges that were kicked out of their homes. I mean, let's remember that Afghanistan was not a hospitable place for LGBT people, even the last 20 years of this transitional democracy. It was still criminalized. And this is, you know, the transitional government for Afghanistan, they met in Bonn, Germany. You know, they met when they did the Bonn Accords to decide this future government of Afghanistan, where basically the US government and Zalmay Khalilzad pressured the Afghans to say, Hamid Karzai will be your next president. They had other people in mind. And at that time, they decided to create a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious framework where everybody will be included into that Afghan society. Well, there's two groups that were not included. One of them was apostates, ex-Muslims who were atheists, agnostic, secular, Christian, or believed, in Afghanistan's ancient religions, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism. Those people were not included into that framework. The other group of people that were not included were LGBTQIA people. And I know that that we've made a lot of progress also in these countries too in the last 20 years, that even how can the Bush administration, right, push for LGBT rights, but that wasn't even their platform. And, for their political party, that's not even what they would do at the time. And so, but still, there was never any kind. I reached out to many governments and said, like in the last decade, like, can you do something about LGBT rights, and in Afghanistan? And nobody answered the door. Nobody responded to my calls. I responded to LGBT organizations for help. A lot of LGBT organizations right now, I've asked them for help, and they said they cannot help because, like, can you endorse these applications for emergency funding so we get these people out? They're like, because we've never worked in Afghanistan before, we can't confirm that or deny that these people are LGBT or not LGBT. Well, if you can never work in Afghanistan, you're never going to know them. You're never going to get funding. And so it's like the circular narrative that just these people have absolutely nothing. And so what's happened in Afghanistan right now, people are being persecuted, not only from the Taliban, but now the society and the people and their families have also turned against them. And they're using very much like Nazi tactics. Like, they're going into communities and asking village elders and communities, like, hand us over your homosexuals. If you're not going to if you provide sanctuary for them, then we're also going to do to them what we do to you. And if you remember last summer in July, Mullah Gul Rahim, he's a Taliban judge, he told Bild, the German newspaper, that there is no amnesty for LGBT people. There's only two solutions: toppling of walls of 10 to 15 feet or stoning them. And this is, so they made no secret about this even before they came to power, right? And since they've come to power, even the finance minister told Reuters in October, LGBT is against Sharia law. There is just zero tolerance for that. We're not going to allow it. And from what I understand, that there's a tension between the moderate wing and the radical wing and the extremist wing of the Taliban, because believe it or not, there is a moderate Taliban. I wouldn't want to live under the moderate Taliban either, but what the moderate Taliban is like, just expel the LGBT people and the other degenerates, so we could just get rid of them, let them leave the country, and we want to be recognized by the international community, but we'd rather not deal with them so we can have our little Islamic utopia. Whereas the radicals are like, no, let's keep them prisoners and slaves and torture them to death. And that's exactly what they're doing. Like what's interesting, like people on my list who have been captured by Taliban, they're sent to prison, they're taken to the police station, they check their phones, they find LGBT content on there, and they beat them up and they torture them, and they do gay reparative therapy. Check how the gay reparative therapy works in Afghanistan. They gang rape those LGBT people in order to cure them from their homosexuality. So this is stuff that's happening, and people are sending me photos and videos like on a daily basis of what's happening to them. And I'm kind of like, why is the international community so slow? I mean, even countries like in Germany, they're not even taking lists for LGBT. They've closed their lists. They're like, whoever got on the German list by the end of August that's it. And they're not even giving feedback on those people. So this problem is not just an American problem. This is also, other Western countries are also guilty of what's happening to LGBT people.
Yes, I agree. I agree completely. So if I understand you correctly, there are currently different violent actors in Afghanistan of different groups, and even regular people taking more action against queer people because they feel legitimized to do so. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. I mean, to the extent like ISIS, for example, would also be potential, because ISIS is a threat in Afghanistan. They're competing with the Taliban, and they would be no better towards LGBT, right?
Yeah.
But the one thing that we know about ISIS, that the thing that ISIS does, and this has been proven in Afghanistan, because in the last decade they take people who have been rejected, have been victims of the Taliban or victims of Afghan society and Afghan families, and try to brainwash them and tell them, look, you're homosexual, but they indoctrinate them into this Islamic ideology or fanatical thing that if you go commit a suicide terrorist attack against these infidels, you'll be purged of your sin and you'll go into the paradise, and you can go there and be a heterosexual, you can go there and live your homosexual dream. These are the kind of things that ISIS does in the recruiting. Mm-hmm. And I've heard it enough from more than one source. We don't know, because like ISIS doesn't put out these pamphlets out, right? But this is something that I've heard from multiple people in Afghanistan. This is what ISIS does. And look, we have had 2 cases when I told people that ISIS recruits and repressed and rejected homosexuals, and to get LGBT people, everybody thought I was a crazy man. And then we had Omar Mateen commit that act. You know, he was supposedly a closeted homosexual, commit that act. We can't prove or deny it, but this is what the rumors are saying, that he was, and that they commit that act against the LGBT, in the largest attack against LGBT in Orlando. And then after that, a bisexual Tunisian man on Bastille Day in South of France, he ran over 70 people. He's also, LGBT, repressed homosexuality. So this is the thing. I mean, we see this even in other places, like in Nazi Germany. We know about closet homosexuals who put other LGBT people, took them to the concentration camps. This happens, everywhere. So it's not far-fetched to believe something like this could happen. But right now, I don't think that that's like the most biggest issue. It is an issue, but it is, and I think the most biggest issue right now is LGBT people, their livelihood. They cannot get out of the house because whatever careers that they had, they're no longer able to have, right? For example, like a lot of the transgenders work as dancers and weddings and other social functions. All of those, music is forbidden. So, and no one can even listen to music in their own homes, which is like, no Islamic country is that extreme, right? And so a lot of transgenders were like makeup artists. They're working for they're celebrity makeup artists. They're working for doing the makeup for stars on the Afghan soap operas or Tolo TV and all those things like that. They can't obviously work. So they're in their home. They don't have their livelihood. They don't have food to just eat. They don't have money to go and get a passport or to renew their passport and to get a visa and to exit the country and go live live in a safe house or live in a hostel in a neighboring country until they get their asylum cases heard, and then go to go to their final destination. So this is where I come into the picture, and I'm trying desperately to raise money to basically get to people inside of, send money to Western Union, MoneyGram, or whatever I can do, whatever way I can get money to my group of people, and get money to them, and basically so that they could go get passports, they could go get renew their visas, then they could try to exit the country, and once they exit the country, then I could somehow start under asylum cases and try to get them to an open and free society where they could go and honor their gender identity and sexual orientation. So that's kind of where I've come into the picture. You know, I'm doing everything from the beginning part until the very end. I'm doing everything.
Okay, I see. Just to clarify, if you talk about queer people, do you talk mostly about gay men, or do you talk also about lesbians?
Yes.
Yes, both.
That's a good question. So my list is 700 people right now, 710 people. Right now, from the 710 list, 160 people have identified as lesbian, transgender, or gender non-binary. So the majority are gay men and bisexual men, gay men mostly. Gay cisgender men is the biggest group. So out of the 700 plus, I would say, let's say 450, yeah, 550 people, 550 people is gay cisgender male.
I see. Okay, and in terms of regions, are they all from Kabul or are they from the countryside as well?
Yes, that's a good question. It's representative of all 34 provinces of Afghanistan. Yeah. The biggest ones is pretty much, of course, Kabul. And then outside of Kabul is Nangarhar and Balkh. So Nangarhar has the largest city is Jalalabad. And Balkh province is Mazar Sharif. So it makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting because Herat is also a big city, or Kandahar is also a big city, but I don't have nearly as many from those cities. And generally what I found that the northern provinces of Afghanistan, the northern and central province is predominantly northern. I have very few people from like Helmand and Kandahar. And I think it's two things. First of all, I'm more of a Farsi speaking Afghan because my family's from Kabul. So the thing is that most of the south, they're like mostly just Pashto. They have very limited English. So there's a language barrier, right? So they don't even know, they probably are not exposed to my efforts or don't even know how to like communicate with me. And so the people from the northern Afghanistan, generally from Kabul and the northern provinces, they all know how to communicate with me because they all speak Dari. And a lot of them speak English, are very well versed in English, and they're also more connected to the international community, and they identify as LGBT, like, right? So there's a lot of men in Kandahar, for example, they engage in homosexuality, but they still don't like the term LGBT. It just feels like it's foreign to them. But a person from like,
is there an Afghan name for it? How would you call it in an Afghan language?
Well, we do have names for, like, we have derogatory names. We also have names, equivalents for gay and homosexuality, but we don't have a term for LGBT. No. We don't have. Everybody says LGBT, okay. and this creates a lot of problems because when people go into Pakistan, for example, LGBT is outlawed in Pakistan, right? But GSM is not. So GSM is gender sexual minorities. Yeah. So that's usually like the transgenders, like transgenders and umbrella, and anything that's kind of close to transgender, like intersex, these types of things. And so they don't see those people as a threat to the patriarchal religious order, but LGBT is like, oh my God, it's emasculating these men who need to like be strong and dominate women and dominate women's like private parts and tell gay men, no, you cannot engage in this, in sodomy and these types of things. So that's why it's a very cultural thing, this LGBT, and then LGBT just feels very Western oriented. But this is what I tell people. It's like a lot of people believe that LGBT, the revolution started from Stonewall, United States, everything came from the United States. No, actually, if you read this beautiful New Yorker article that talked about Berlin being the gay capital of the 19th century, Berlin, pre-Hitler, Weimar Germany was a flourishing gay community. It had legalization of gay rights, right? So I think that the kind of cultural, like LGBT culture that was there, the kind of the scene and like all the cabaret and all the lesbian clubs and newspapers for LGBT and everything in Berlin, like it's like we just whitewashed all of that and said no, it all started from the United States after Germany had this US occupation. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan. It's like Afghanistan did have this rich fluid history. Of course, we never had LGBT rights legalized and codified into law, but we did have societal attitudes in the ancient past where it was tolerated, like in the Mughal dynasty, which started from Central Asia and then and went from Central Asia, then to Kabul, then to India, New Delhi, the Mughal dynasty. They would basically employ LGBT people to groom their princes because they felt that LGBT people were proper and more dignified and they could teach people proper etiquette. A prince needed to learn etiquette by LGBT people. It's not interesting, right? so I think these types of things, these nuances, I think that's what's get lost in the translation. And we see kind of like, those are things, like cultural things that happen there. But what happens, like just like in India, when we looked at, for example, like Section 377, the decriminalization, I think that the radical Hindus, the radical Muslims, and then the British sodomy laws that were there for centuries that prevented sodomy, I think that stifled, the Indian culture to think that this is a bad thing. But Kama Sutra has a whole chapter on homosexuality, and that was written 2,500 years ago. And I think this is the problem I have with this thing. It's like now, it's like you promote kind of in a roundabout way LGBT rights in Afghanistan, and you give these people this idea that they could choose their freedom because it's a democracy now. Because what happened was LGBT people who were leaving Afghanistan and going to Western countries were denying and rejecting their asylum cases. And I would have asylum cases from Belgium and from Netherlands and from Sweden, from UK contacting me and like, please, can you vouch for this LGBT person in the case because the judges are not going to prove it. And often, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But it's like, my focus is to change attitudes in Afghanistan. I can't do caseworker stuff here, but I did as best as I could. And one of the things, like the Guardian, there was a Guardian article you could look at from 4 years ago that the Home Office of the UK said that we're going to deport LGBT people back to Afghanistan because you're not coming from a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran, which is very explicit in its no tolerance. Because Afghanistan under Ashraf Ghani and under Hamid Karzai, it pretended that it was a benign, benevolent towards LGBT, but then quietly there was elements within the government that were doing this gay cleansing policy. They were using the National Director of Security, instead of like clamping down, preventing terrorist attacks, they're tapping gay and bisexual men to kind of lure them into honey traps and then take them out so the LGBT networks wouldn't grow. So these things were happening there. And obviously they were finding transgenders and other gay people who were like bringing them to prison and raping them, finding them, and then somebody from the Ministry of Interior would try to get them released. It was these kind of things happened there. And so the Home Office of the UK said, it's fine. You guys came from a democracy. NATO is there. Just go back to Afghanistan and pretend to be straight and everything should be fine. How insulting is that to tell an LGBT person just pretend to be straight? So this is where I'm talking about. It's like, and now this problem was created. This problem was created the last 20 years of this Western countries just ignoring the situation for LGBT people. And now they're still not doing anything. They're the first to be executed, last to be evacuated. On the US evacuation flight, it's first US citizens at the top, then green card holders, then special immigration visa, then P2 designation was equivalent of refugee, then P1 status. About half my list is about a clear for P1 status. That means that they're not on the no-fly list. They're not like a known terrorist, so they're clear for P1. But then my other list, people who recently joined, like the State Department hasn't even cleared them, so they're nothing. So the chances of them getting on a U.S. evacuation flight is very, very chance. Because from what I understand, there's now millions of people on these lists to get on the State Department list, right? Like I just spoke recently, 3 weeks ago, I spoke to someone from Immigration Refugees Canada, from the government office that helps with resettlement. They said that Canada is giving 40,000 slots for Afghan nationals to come to Canada in the coming years. Guess how many requests they already have from Afghanistan, and just for Afghan refugees? It's over 1 million. So it's fierce competition. Like basically these humanitarian visas are more expensive than gold. They're more expensive than Bitcoin. It's like, it's the most expensive thing right now, this humanitarian visa that anybody can get for any Western country. It's a scarce asset.
Yes. Oh God, sounds terrible. Let's focus on the history of queer people in Afghanistan for a minute. How was queer life before the Taliban came back to power? So in the last 20 years or so, from 2001 till last summer?
That's a very good question. So I really can't speak so much between 2001 until 2012 when I first landed there, because I was there, so I can't really speak about it. But what I do know from other people who've told me is that, like, let's say 2005 is when the terrorist attacks started happening. That's when Pakistan got very vigilant in training Taliban and madrasas and helping, emboldening the Taliban to get back to Afghanistan, because the United States and NATO was weakened in Afghanistan, and US was distracted in Iraq, right? It was in the quagmire and the war in Iraq. So up until that point, there's what they call the Ka bubble. This is like the expat community. They had parties and everything, and apparently LGBT people were getting invited there. So that was like the first LGBT community in Afghanistan, their first exposure, meeting other LGBT people, expats who had come in from other parts of the world to do, work in empowering civil society in Afghanistan. They really learned about this thing, and they kind of engaged, and they had rendezvous and affairs, and quietly doing things like that, right? But that's a very privileged group of Afghans, right? How many Afghans are connected to expats, right? So, but the vast majority of Afghans, the way it was for them, it's like they would meet the kind of places where people meet everywhere for cruising. Like they would meet in gyms and like hammams, in malls, and also parks. And so that's what it's based on. And then also, like, a lot of gay men would kind of like on the buses, when it gets very crowded, they would kind of like brush up against each other, if they were, and to kind of like give them a signal or cue, nonverbal communication, like, I was do something. And then they would get off the bus and go to a shopkeeper's place and say, can we rent out one of your rooms and just do our little business? And then they would leave and not even exchange phone numbers or names or anything like that. That's kind of how it was.
And what about the women?
That's a good question, because women, because it's a gender segregated society, a lot of lesbians were able to meet, like before marriage, other women and have the sexual encounters. But a lot of lesbians would tell me that actually that they had never any choice to really stand up for their families to say, no, I don't want this. A lot of them just accepted a life of being raped, because they realized they had to marry, everybody had to marry the opposite sex, right? But with women, it was very hard for them to say no to their family. Like, no, I don't want to marry a man, right? So it was very difficult for them. And so I would say actually in the last 20 years, it was most difficult for lesbian people, because at least with gay men, they could go out of the house. A lot of transgenders who were kicked out of their parents' house in different provinces, they would leave and come to Kabul and then meet up with other transgenders, live with them, and then try to like build their life and do these types of things.
Okay, so do they have some sort of strategies of secrecy, or how they organize things?
Yeah, so basically my own, so organizing, I would say that's a good question. They do have this underground, like in the last 10 years. So basically I give you the things of how it was up until like 2012 and 13. What happened was, after I came out of the closet, it really pushed people to push social progress. So this is what I tell people, and not just the last 10 years, the last 20 years, LGBT people were fighting at the front lines they're in the front lines of this war on terror and war on radical Islam, in terms of fighting the intellectual war, which is actually more courageous than fighting in the battlefield. So this is why I have a problem with US and its allies, that they give prioritized interpreters and translators because they fought with us in the battlefield. But what about the battle of ideas? The battle of ideas, LGBT people were involved predominantly in mass media and pop culture, right? So a lot of them went into like worked as journalists. A lot of them worked. There was a radio show that somebody was offering that was LGBT, that was providing sexual advice to spouses of how to properly sexually stimulate your partner, right? That's very risky and cutting edge for Afghanistan. There was basically all kinds of programming in Afghanistan. There's fashion shows, there was concerts. Like I mentioned to you before, transgenders being so visible, there were celebrity makeup artists, right? These types of things were predominantly led by LGBT people. There's LGBT people that went and infiltrated the NGOs and worked in gender rights or HIV and AIDS prevention and talking about like MSM and men to men having sex. And then they would creep in the ideas of LGBT rights, you know? So that was the kind of coy. So they kind of used whatever way they could to bring these ideas into Afghanistan. To bring these ideas into Afghanistan, they worked for human rights organizations in Afghanistan, and they were kind of just a mere mentioning and passing of LGBT was a lot, was enough to get that going. And so what happened was, I would say that 2013, 14, 15, I saw a little bit of change. And then since 2016 to here forward, huge change. I mean, look, half of the gay cisgender men on my list are trying to leave with their same-sex partners, and a lot of lesbians too, by the way. Yeah, and not all of them, but a good number of them actually lived with their own partners before the Taliban came to power. That's revolution, not just for Afghan culture, but a lot of Asian cultures where you don't leave your parents' home until you marry the opposite sex, right? So things really, at the rate it was going right now, I believe there would have been full LGBT rights, same-sex marriage within the next 10 years in Afghanistan. And I think that's why that Taliban and Pakistani ISI, they basically knew that, okay, wait a minute. If Afghanistan goes in this direction and there's like all this expansion of LGBT rights, it's a threat to Sharia laws, it's a threat to Islamic order. We lose our identity, our reason to exist. So this is why the backlash and like fighting against that. And what the thing is, like Afghanistan, if it goes dark, the entire Muslim world, entire world goes dark. If you light up Afghanistan like a fire, there will be light everywhere, going everywhere, like a candle that will like shine bright everywhere around the world. And because it is geostrategically, it is whatever ideology dominates over Afghanistan dominates the world. That's why superpower after superpower keeps going into Afghanistan, knowing they're going to lose, right? But they still keep going because they're like, if we don't go, we're also going to lose. So I know this is a little bit the geopolitics of Afghanistan. You had the British people who fought 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, but they still went in with the Americans and NATO, didn't they? So they've been in 4 times in Afghanistan, but they will go a 5th time. And this is the Chinese, knowing the experience of the United States, knowing the experience of the Soviet Union, knowing the experience of the British, knowing the experience of Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great, every army that's ever come to Afghanistan, knowing all of that, the Chinese are going into Afghanistan. They are literally they want to take over. The 21st century is no longer, the other fear is this politics, the geopolitics wars, right? The Arab countries and the OPEC states are run on fossil fuels, right? The world, because of the climate crisis, is moving towards green technology. Who is the Saudi Arabia of lithium? Afghanistan. Afghanistan has more lithium deposits than any country in the world. It's untapped, and all these other mineral sources like copper and other things. The Chinese, it's a land grab. So, Elon Musk will not be able to get his Tesla lithium because now the Chinese are going to go there and take it all, hoard it up for themselves with the help of the Taliban and Pakistan. So this is the situation we face. There is going to be a civil war over these natural resources, and there'll not just be a civil war, a transnational war between China, India, Pakistan. Pakistan will use Taliban. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan will be backed by Russia, and then you'll have Iran fighting over this, and you have the expansion of Islamic ideology vis-a-vis the Taliban going all over the world, because when they saw those coffins of the French flag and the American flag, the British flag being carried, it's a great recruiting tool to young Islamists saying, look, becoming terrorists, we won, we're winning. And they could bring this ideology to Europe and the rest of the world. There'll be terrorist attacks, and then everybody will be going back to Afghanistan again. There's a genocide brewing because of all the starvation in Afghanistan right now. And people are like, it's closed in. It's become like an Islamic North Korea because people can't get out, right? And then on top of that, you have this this ideology that's there. You have problems with refugees, you have problem with terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. You're going to go back into Afghanistan and you're like, why did we ever leave in the first place? So this is the problem. This is the thing that people don't realize. Before the Afghanistan fell, people are like, okay, we have climate crisis, we have China, we have COVID. These are the top national security issues in the world. But now it's like Afghanistan is on that list. I mean, we proved it. But now it's like, oh, we could just get out of there and be fine. But that's when you keep ignoring Afghanistan, then it keeps coming back on the top of the agenda.
Yeah, right. This brings me to another big question. What do you think is the relationship between all these developments and what is called political Islam and Islamism, or specific manifestations and interpretations of religious practices of Islam? What is the relationship with all of this? How would you classify it?
You know what, for me personally, I know this is a very politically incorrect situation. For me, of course, there are different variations or different gradations. What the Taliban they're not even allowing the permission of music. But for me, there's no shining example of any country that's under Sharia law that is a beacon of enlightenment, of liberation, of empowerment of anybody. You know, even the people who are the people who are the oppressors are also oppressed by oppressing other people, right? Because it's because they're in a position where they constantly have to enslave other people. That's not freedom. They're also like obligated to, they're burdened by shackled by this Islamic ideology. And for me, of course, there are different ideas. Like, for example, an Islamist, for example, is the political person, is very different than, for example, a moderate Muslim who may not openly express. A moderate Muslim might just want to live in a democratic society, but they might not want to express their things. But for me, at the end of the day, when you follow any of those clear paths of any gradations of Islam, it's always going to revert back to the darker medieval version. A good example of that is Turkey. Turkey's explored a century after Kemal Atatürk secularization, and now Erdogan is basically erasing everything in just a couple of years, right? So I disagree with that. Tell me one example of one Islamic country today that allows LGBT community to thrive. There's none. There's absolutely none. So everyone is buried in the closet. So when people say that Islam gives me empowerment, it's a feminist tool and stuff, I have to disagree with that, because it's not. It's you're pretty much what I've seen, my own experience, is that a lot of the Muslim Americans, a lot of Muslims who are living in Western countries, they use Islam as a cover because of their own marginalization that they face. Like in the United States, it is a fact that Muslim Americans were oppressed by Donald Trump and racial white supremacists, right? That is a fact. And that is a fact in everywhere, right? White supremacy is a problem, right? It's not, I'm not trying to deny it is a problem, but going and like reinforcing your own Islamic identity is not your source of liberation, because you've left Afghanistan. This is what I tell Muslim Americans from Afghanistan. You've left Afghanistan because you didn't like living under Sharia law. You didn't like living under a jihadi state, right? And you come here and you're living under secular constitution, but you're saying that Islam is good and you're defending Islam, and you're saying that, no, that's not, that doesn't make any sense to me. And from my own experience, I can tell you from my own experience, I've received more discrimination from Afghan Americans and Muslim Americans and other Muslims in the West for the work that I have done in the last decade in Afghanistan. So that's the most people that I've received, like, for example, death threats and curses and a fatwa. I received a fatwa by the mullahs in Afghanistan. You know what I mean? And so for me, it's very hard for people to say, you know what, people who are very tolerant who reached the West. No, my own relatives have rejected me, right? So it's like, I don't agree with that. You know, it's just like, you're living in this country, you should understand that we should all coexist and have tolerance for each other, but why are you not accepting other people? So I think this whole residue, there needs to be a clear separation of Islam and state. And we haven't seen that yet in anywhere in the Muslim world. And I think the solution to this is the solution of, you know, whether you're talked about, you know, political Islam and jihadi Islam and all these different moderate Islam and all these different Islam, I think that the solution is to empower ex-Muslims, whether they're heterosexuals or LGBT, it doesn't matter, but the ex-Muslim movement. And people talk about Muslim reformists, right? People who are within Muslims who want to reform their religion, that's fine too. But I think the most reinforcement we need to have is the ex-Muslim movement.
I see we are running out of time. This is, I see. So I think we need to come to a completely different questions.
Sure.
So you talked about this at the beginning. How do LGBT people in Afghanistan or queer Afghans see the West? Did this view change? And if so, how?
Well, that's very fascinating, right? Because a lot of my people on my list are LGBT and ex-Muslim. Not all of them, but many of them are ex-Muslim too. A lot of them are very upset. I mean, they see their main villain as being Pakistan. Pakistan is the main enemy of the United States. It was of Russia, because it defeated those countries using, the Taliban and Mujahideen then. And then really it's beat and battered Afghanistan through its proxy armies, Baluchistan, India, and Bangladesh. And the fact that the United States and Western countries have allowed Pakistan to wreak that much havoc onto the world and not do anything is just like, how can this even happen? Like, Iran's major threat to the world is Israel, but is Pakistan's threat to the world is everyone. And it's like, nobody's done anything. And I just feel like they're not really committed to this fight, because when people were, the US was committed to fight against like Nazi Germany or Mussolini and Italy, and about, going after Imperial Japan, they were really serious about committing the ideological war. Here in this fight, this war in Afghanistan will continue to go unless Pakistan is sanctioned and Pakistan is brought to its knees. And so that's why people are very upset at the Americans. But most of my LGBT lists, still their dream is to move to America, despite how much they hate America. And I think that goes, that the paradox here is that living under occupation, they see the Central Park, they see the Hollywood movies, the Wall Street, all of this fascination of everybody in America has a good life. They see the Instagram photos and everything of all celebrities. And they still think that they could come here and create a better life for themselves. And after the United States, their dream place is to go to Canada. And so unfortunately, Germany is not their top choice. I tell them, go to Netherlands. But anyway.
Speaking of Germany, I personally agree that the complete failure of the West, not just since yesterday, but for quite some time now. So the question is, what could Germany do, for example, now that German politicians have finally managed to form a government, right? They might even been able to focus on foreign policy for a second. So what would real support look like? What would really help?
I think what would really help at this point is saving as many LGBT lives as possible, and basically doing whatever you can to evacuate people. Germany can evacuate people from Afghanistan, or if they get to a neighboring country, they get to Iran, they get to Pakistan, they get to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Like the embassies of German embassy in those countries should be able to process LGBT people and prioritize them. Like even if LGBT people come in and they come in later than non-LGBT people, you should give those people priority status leave, because they have less resources. They're going to die off in these neighboring countries without any resources, right? Or they have to be involved in like sex work or do some crazy stuff just to make earning a livelihood. So I think Germany, actually, I was really angry at Germany. I said how shameful it is that this country that basically had the experience of how many homosexuals that were killed in a concentration camp, and Germans said never again. And where are, because what the Taliban are, they are Islamic Nazis, right? So where are the Germans? The Germans should be the first people of all people to go and help LGBT people in Afghanistan. And they haven't done that. They've closed their doors. They're not welcoming anybody. It's so hard to get anybody in the German government or any German organizations. They're like, we can't do anything. Germany's not interested. And this is it's going to leave a very dark stain on Germany, because Germany could even, like, we're talking about, of course, there's a lot of LGBT people. There's probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of LGBT people in a country of 40 million, right? But the ones that have identified themselves as LGBT and Afghan on a list, it's 700 on my list, and I have like the largest list. But if you count everybody in their list, it's a little bit over 1,000 people, right? So if you're getting 1,000 people distributed between Germany and other Western countries, is not a lot of people. So what can we do to get these people out and help them? And then once these people are out, these 1,000 people, the human rights defenders, the LGBT activists among them, can help their own, they can help their own brothers and sisters in Afghanistan. At least provide oxygen for them, send them money, do anything to make sure that LGBT people survive. I mean, how can we allow just the total annihilation and just let them go, like let LGBT people go to their own demise? This is just horrific.
We have, in a way, to say now the time is not really over. We do not cut, but we have a little bit charming to fade out. Nemat, this is so impressive what you're talking about, and this is going straight to my heart and to so many hearts of our viewers. And one viewer, Lutz van Dijk from South Africa, is asking us, asking you, do you think fundraising would help you? Do you have contact with the NGO All Out?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm familiar with All Out, but right now, the ones that are really, and I would definitely support their organization too, because I know they're doing fundraising for LGBT Afghans. The fundraising to support my list directly, I do have a GoFundMe that you could find. It's on my social media pages for LGBT Afghans. Now, if people want a tax-deductible donation, and you knowing that it's like a nonprofit organization that is going to send the money directly to the people on my list. If you're in Europe, please donate to Coalition Plus, which is based in France, and the link is on their Coalition Plus website, and also on my Twitter you can find it. And then also, if you're in the United States, if you can please, or elsewhere in the world, please donate to Secular Policy Institute, and please donate, when you're donating to them, emergency response for LGBT Afghans, or emergency response for the humanitarian crisis for LGBT Afghans. So people will know that the donation will go to the people on my list. And it's a 501c3, so you'll get a tax-deductible receipt. So thank you for mentioning that.
Nemat, we have our new government by liberals, Greens, and Social Democrats. They have said in their coalition contract to help queer people to have it easier to go into the status of being a refugee. And we hope this will get true. And we will work on, and I think we must very, very necessarily our talk the next year, and we would talk about your issues, and we will support your work. It's very, very important, not only for the Afghanistan queer people.
Thank you so much.
I agree. I only asked, about 10% of the questions I had on my list. So I think we should continue this conversation. Yes, but because, I'm a historian and I had so many questions about history, but, right now I feel the real pressing question is how to get people out of Afghanistan, right? And the current catastrophe, and it's a disaster. The current situation is a disaster, and it's incredibly shameful how the West deals with this situation. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today. Maybe one last question. What do you think will happen in the future?
Oh, what do you think will happen? Well, this is the thing. I am committed, by the end of 2022, I'm committed to not just evacuating, but evacuating and resettling at least 1,000 LGBT people. And let's just say, I don't think that the Taliban will remain in power for more than 5 to 7 years, unless they get full recognition by the international community, which I highly doubt is going to happen. And this is going to be very prophetic, because it will come like this. The Taliban are going to, maybe not ISIS, but they're going to allow other terrorist groups to come in and continue their terrorist activity against US and Western interests. And people will be fed up with the Taliban and will want to topple the Taliban. So that's inevitable. That is going to happen. History repeats itself, unfortunately. And this is Afghanistan's experience, and, Afghanistan resisted 200 years against the Islamic forces that tried to come in this from 7th to 9th century. And this is what's going on now, that this 43 years of war is preventing this indoctrination and saying, no, we don't want this. We want to be like a pagan, free, multicultural society, multicultural society. We don't want this stuff. And it's trying to impose their will onto them from different parts of the world. So I think what's going to happen is that, for me personally, I'm committed. Let's say if Taliban remain in power for the next 5 to 7 years, I'm committed to get every last LGBT person out of Afghanistan. Well, an LGBT person is born every day, so I'm not going to stop, right? So that is based, and I think this is what I will have to say. I don't want to. I've really created a lot of enemies. Western governments and nonprofit organizations do not like me. Because what I'm trying to do is, they know I'm committed, being a gay Afghan refugee and activist, and now humanitarian. They know my heart is not in this to exploit this situation. They know my heart is in this to save every LGBT person. And I don't think that's what they signed up for. I mean, a lot of Western governments want to cut themselves off and just say Afghanistan, out of sight, out of mind. And a lot of these LGBT or non-LGBT organizations that have helped Afghanistan, that are helping or want to help or have helped, they just want to help a small group of people and say, here, we help these people, we're done with it. They don't want to be affiliated with me because I'm committed for the long haul. I'm committed to get every single person out. And they're not, that's why I think it's too much for them. It's too much resources, time, and energy that they don't want to commit themselves to. So it's better to just block me or push me away. But I'm not going away. I'm indestructible. And I keep coming back meaner and bigger and more with vengeance.
Okay, that sounds great. So thank you.
So if I have to evacuate 10,000 people for the duration of of the Taliban, I will do that.
Okay. And I assume you will go back to that work after our conversation right away, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Nemat, we will meet again next April. We have a talk in the frame of the taztalk. It's our big congress, and you are one of our most glamorous guests, for sure. And our wish is, do not stop your work. We need you, and the world needs your work, and it's so important. Nemat, thank you very much. We keep in touch. And liebes Publikum, ich will noch sagen, danke für Ihre zahlreiche Teilnahme. Sie haben uns viele Bemerkungen geschickt. Meine Kollegin und Mitherausgeberin vom Jahrbuch Sexualitäten, Vera Kallenberg, hat vieles davon in ihre Fragen mit einfließen lassen. Ich will noch kurz sagen, dieses Format des Taz-Talks wird nur ermöglicht durch taztalk. Spenden Sie. Das ist keine Zeit für Geiz, das sowieso nicht. Und der nächste Talk wird sein am kommenden Montag um 19 Uhr, spricht der Berliner Autor und Pfleger Frédéric Vallin über seine unschöne oder über seinen ungeschönten Einblick in die Arbeitsrealität von Care-Berufen. Er spricht über sein Buch Pflegeprotokolle. Und auch diesen Abend werde ich moderieren, freue ich mich drauf. Kommen Sie gut übers Wochenende. Nemat, thank you very much. It was so charming. I'm so my heart is bleeding. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I am so sorry to emotionally attack you that way.
No, it's completely perfect. Und ich möchte nicht vergessen, wir neigen ja dem Credo des FC Liverpool und seiner Stadionhymne zu, die bedeutet nämlich "We never walk alone". Und deswegen will ich unbedingt unsere beiden Kollegen, die hinten in der Technik alles zubereitet haben, Peter Rohrmann, und heute hat sie fast ihre Debütschicht als Ombudsmenschen, Laura Sauer. Toll, dass ihr dabei seid. Zeigt euch nochmal groß. Oder ist es jetzt nur meine technische Einstellung? Und so winken wir dem Publikum. Schön, dass Sie zugeschaut haben. Und nehmen Sie sich das alles zu Herzen. Die Welt ist schön, aber es muss auch noch vieles erkämpft werden. Adieu, Dankeschön.